With the Edmonton Oilers beginning informal skates this week, it's time to take a first crack of early September at what the opening night lineup might look like.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who's making Locked On Oilers a part of their day, making it their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Today's episode, we are going to talk about lineup construction, what I think the Oilers lineup is going to look like on opening night. We are going to delicately and preemptively title this Edmonton Oilers Lineup Prediction 1.0, because as the preseason goes along, as training camp goes along, we will start to get a better understanding of who is going to play with who, what is just a daily face-off projection, what makes sense strategy-wise, what makes sense stylistically. Because when you have the amount of roster turnover the Oilers had in the offseason, you got to remember you're going to start the year without two of the wings you had in your top six at various points last year in Evander Kane and Warren Foegele. You lost Ryan McLeod. You lost Dylan Holloway. You lost Cody Ceci. You lost Philip Broberg, even though Broberg didn't really play until the end of the regular season. But you get what I'm saying here. When you have this much turnover, it's natural to want to take a step back and try and figure out what makes the most sense. So the first concept I really want to get into in the opening segment of our show, we're going to focus on how the Oilers can most optimally deploy their lineup. And the buzzword, the hot subject matter in the NHL now, and this is something that I've talked about a little bit on the show, but the idea that you want to control the game, that you want to separate your best players from each other as much as possible so you can dictate as much of the game as possible. This gets to the idea of playing McDavid and Draisaitl away from each other as much as you possibly can. So that way, those 20-ish minutes at 5-on-5, 21 minutes, 22 minutes, depending on the given night, each of those guys plays, if they're almost entirely separate from each other, you're going to have the best player on the ice most nights for 40-ish minutes of the game, and that doesn't include power play. So you get that in the mix as well. And really quickly, you're talking about the opportunity to control almost half of the game, more than half of the game with those two guys when you play them separate from each other. And the Oilers also have the luxury of having one of the premier young offensive defensemen in the league in Evan Bouchard, where you have a third guy in the mix that if you really wanted to try and diversify your lineup, really try and separate all three of your star players, where McDavid is out there, where Draisaitl is out there, and then where Bouchard is out there, you have the opportunity to control almost the entire game. Now, that is antithetical, the antithesis of what Chris Knoblauch did during his time as interim head coach, and I assume what he's going to do going forward as head coach in his first full season, his second season behind the bench. Knoblauch is one of the coaches, and most coaches do this. You know, you can look at McKinnon's numbers without Makar. You can look at Panarin's numbers without Adam Fox. You can look at Elias Pettersson's without Quinn Hughes, Pasternak's without Charlie McAvoy. You want to get your best defenseman out there with your best forward at the same time, and you just outright dominate those minutes those guys are together. We have seen, and we did see over the course of that playoff run, and at the end, especially down the back half of the regular season, Chris Knoblauch's ideal deployment is getting McDavid and Bouchard out there as often as possible. It doesn't matter who they're out there against. It doesn't matter what the game state is. They want to keep rolling that line every fourth shift with Bouchard, with Ekholm, and keeping it moving. Of course, I do want to point this out. Hockey is not basketball. Hockey is not football. You are not going to hard match, and you are not only going to be able to play certain guys with certain guys. This is not like basketball where we can sub out a certain player to bring in a certain player only when certain guys on the other team are in the game. You are not going to see Connor McDavid play only against another team's third defensive pair because the game is too free-flowing. There aren't the defined stoppages that there are in the other sports where you have the opportunity to match personnel. You can try and do that cat and mouse avoiding player A with player B. But for the most part, you're going to end up, everybody's going to play a little bit with everyone and against a little bit of everyone. So with that in mind, the stats I have are very straightforward here. When we talk about building out the lineup around two dominant lines, we're obviously talking about building them around McDavid and around Draisaitl. So McDavid, without Draisaitl last year, 766 minutes, 58% of the scoring chances, 64% of the goals, 60% of the expected goals, 65% of the high danger goals. Draisaitl without McDavid last year, 790 minutes, 54% of the scoring chances, 57% of the goals, 56% of the expected goals, 58 of the high danger chances. Together, 466 minutes, 58% of the scoring chances, 64% of the goals, 60% of the expected goals, and 63% of the high danger goals. So those splits are relatively conjoined. You know, there is not a huge disparity from McDavid by himself, Draisaitl by himself to together. So in theory, and we're talking very loosely in theory, our working idea is we're going to try and play those guys away from each other as much as possible. We also feel that we have a deeper bottom six than we have in years past. Not necessarily maybe the most talented bottom six, but we have more options than we have in the past. When you have Connor Brown another year removed from surgery, you can assume he's going to be closer to the player he was in the playoffs as opposed to what he was during the regular season, where he was pretty ineffective. You saw flickers of Janmark in the postseason. Derek Ryan, Corey Perry, Vasily Podkolzin, that's a bit more of a mixed bag of uncertainty. You don't exactly know what you're going to get from those guys in this particular season, if how much they're going to play together. You don't know who the candidates are, maybe internally to be that 13th forward to push Corey Perry, because I can't imagine Corey Perry at 38, 39 years old is going to be an every game player. I think especially the longer you go in a difficult season like that's ahead, every hockey season is difficult. You're going to go through, 30 to 40 roster players over the course of an entire season if you are a team that's going to make some noise, because you're constantly tinkering. You're constantly trying to get opportunities. And knock on wood, the injury bug does eventually come for people. And that's really something that's hard to account for. And there is no way to account for. So that's why you want to separate those guys as much as possible. That's why you want to have as much strength throughout your lineup as possible, with the idea being you want to have as little drop off from one line to another as possible. You want to control the game state by default. And the less drop off you have from one line to another, it enables more of that free flow and control state you want to be in as a good hockey team. You think about the opportunities you're going to have over the course of a season, and the more chances, the more different types of ways you can create offense, the more likely you are to be successful. Think about what we talked about on yesterday's show on the Victor Arvidsson episode, and then think about what we talked about on Monday on the Jeff Skinner episode. The idea, you want to have different types of players on all different lines. You want to have a little bit of forechecking, you want to have a little bit of playmaking, and you want to have a little bit of goal scoring on all three lines. That way, from all three players across four lines. That way the other team doesn't start to sit on things. And that is an issue for the Oilers, that they do become a bit too one-dimensional, and they do end up waiting on their star players to make plays to break open the game. And you can't always get that. Sometimes it's just not their night. As great as McDavid is, as great as Draisaitl is, even the stars will have nights where they're not going to be able to record a point. It happens. And the Oilers, and having a deeper lineup, have a bit more insulation against that. So coming up next on this episode of Locked On Oilers, we are going to dive into what we're going to do defensively going into this upcoming season. We'll touch on Travis Dermott coming in on a PTO and a whole lot more on this episode of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around, where we've got your team covered every day. Summer might almost be over, but if you are like me, you are clinging to every last second of summer. You want to get out there to a concert. You want to get out there to a baseball game. Or if you're antsy for hockey and you want to look into getting yourself some Oilers tickets, you should go check in with our friends over at Gametime with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. Things like Gametime picks, where curation makes it easier to save on sports, comedy, and theater. All in pricing, where you toggle the feature on up front and there are no surprise fees at checkout. You can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy with the seat view if you're going to a baseball game. You want to see balls and strikes. You want to be able to see the entire field when the ball is in play. Know what you're buying before you buy with the panoramic seat view. The lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with the national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insights on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hunter Hodes and I will be talking about the Pacific Division on tomorrow's episode. So if you want to talk about, get an idea of where the Oilers are at in relation to their competition within the division, tomorrow's episode will give you a nice primer. We are going to do individual previews about the other teams across the league. We're going to get some guests. We're going to try and mix things up so it's not just me. As much as I enjoy doing research, I know there is value in getting opinions of other people to kind of get a more well-rounded perspective, get an understanding of things I might not think about because I don't watch that given team any given day. But as far as the Oilers, we're all in agreement coming into this season. The defense is going to be the question mark. You have one of the best first pairs in the entire NHL. Evan Bouchard is a top 10 defenseman in the league. Mattias Ekholm is one of the 5 best defensive defensemen in the entire league. You put those two together, they are going to control the game. You put them out there with McDavid, like the Oilers did for most of those minutes they could, as many minutes as they could last year, you're going to outright dominate, which is the case. But I do want to preemptively get this out there. I do think there is a good chance at points this season you will see that pair split up. I think that to start, you are going to see something along the lines of Ekholm with Bouchard, Stetcher with Nurse, or Emberson with Nurse, and then Kulak with whichever of Nurse or Emberson is not playing with Nurse. That way, you have mitigated some risk. You are hoping that Nurse is able to play a little bit better with a more stable partner who's a little less volatile in Stetcher or Emberson than Cody Ceci. As I've said a lot, Cody Ceci is an imperfect understanding of what a good hockey player is. Sure, he's mobile. Sure, he's a good dude. But his inability to really make plays and make good decisions, it mitigated how good of a skater he was. And that's why he's still in the league and why he's going to hang around. That even at his age, even 12 years in, he's still an above average skater for his position. And teams are going to be willing to keep giving him chances because of that, because they think all we got to do is get him the right partner. We get him with the right forwards and he can break out the puck. I mean, if he can skate to the puck, he can move the puck. So you've heard me discuss this topic before, but you want diversity in your lineup. And on the back end, on defense, that means puck retriever, puck distributor. In an ideal world, you have a player who's good at both. Somebody who can go get it and then move it. But very similarly to offense, the way we don't have dynamic guys there aren't a lot of guys who are great at everything. It's the same thing with defense. So with that in mind, you don't want redundant skill sets. With that in mind, you want to have retriever, mover. That's why I personally am more inclined to believe Stetcher makes more sense with Nurse, because Emberson and Nurse, they're similar in terms of size, in terms of skating, and both profile more as puck retrievers rather than puck movers. And when you put two puck retrievers together, you're going to get more turnovers in the defensive zone. You are going to get more rims off the glass out into the neutral zone, and you are going to get more alley-oops out of the defensive zone into the neutral zone to just try and mitigate pressure, because those types of defensemen are not able to move the puck well. You think about the difference between a Bouchard Ekholm breakout and a Nurse Ceci breakout. One component of this is the Oilers forwards. I know the Oilers, because of the talent they have, especially last season where they were able to get a little bit of their speed throughout the lineup, you get an organized regroup where a defenseman behind the net gets the puck to McDavid, or they leave a drop pass for McDavid. He'll loop around and get that full head of speed. Same thing with Dylan Holloway at various points last year. Draisaitl, they don't do it from the dead of the defensive zone, but You let that guy build up a head of steam and skate as fast as they can. It puts pressure on the other team's blue line. It allows you to gain the zone with speed, and it gives you options to distribute once you gain the zone. The problem with that is it means that if that forward does not come back to help that breakout, it becomes a lot more tricky. Those defensemen are inclined to just rim it, to play it safe, because they don't want to have to make a play on the puck. And it is a difficult place to be when you do not have that defined puck mover on your pair, because both guys find themselves in a position where, okay, I got to go get the puck. No, he has to go get it. No, we both. And ideally, you would like the ability to have both in each of your defensemen. But being that that is a very unique and rare set of skills, to have both of those traits together, you are more inclined to lean on one guy to do one thing and one guy to do the other. That does make you a bit one-dimensional as a pair, that the defense can start to assume that the guy going back to get it is going to move it to the guy who's moving it. But if you're good at moving it, you can get around the fact that the defense is anticipating you moving it. You look at the best puck movers in the world, whether it's Yossi, Quinn Hughes, Adam Fox, Charlie McAvoy, Cale Makar, Devon Tays. Those guys are able to skate the puck out of danger. They are able to pass the puck out of danger. And when you look at the Oilers right now, outside of that first pair, there are questions. I think at some point this season, you will see an entirely different permutation of six defensemen than what we're penciling in right now, because I do think at various points this year, you are going to need to play Bouchard with Nurse, or you're going to need to play Ekholm with Emerson, just because you want to try and mitigate that risk. And the idea is a carry job, effectively. You know, if you're familiar with that terminology from video games or just general sports yapping, I don't know exactly what word I want to use to describe it, but you're going to see carry jobs this year. You are going to see Evan Bouchard tasked with carrying Darnell Nurse. You know, the same way the Oilers threw Philip Broberg on Nurse's right and said, "You'll be fine, figure it out." You will see that happen at points this year with Bouchard, with Ekholm, with other defensemen on the team, to try and lay off some of that risk, to not put so much on those lower two pairs, because as good as that first pair is, they can only play so many minutes. And the less drop off you have from line to line, pair to pair, the more well-rounded your team is, the more competitive you are, the better chance you're going to have on any given night to win the hockey game. The Oilers are going to win a lot of regular season hockey games, but as we've discussed a lot, winning in the regular season does not necessarily translate to winning in the postseason. The way you play in the regular season versus the postseason, the type of opponent you're going to play, the game environments you're going to be in terms of scoring impacts, goaltending, the quality of defense, they are different. And that's why it's hard for some teams that have a lot of regular season success to adjust, because they just spent 82 regular season games playing really well and they won 50 of them. And then you get to the playoffs and you're going to tell those same people who just won 50 regular season games, hey, what you just did isn't going to work. You need to change what you're doing. It's hard for teams to do that, and I understand why teams don't do that. We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk big picture. We're going to talk a little bit about what the lineup probably looks like to start, where there are opportunities for guys to maybe play in, and a whole lot more on this edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around, where we've got your team covered every day. We are all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search. Match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Indeed leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every single day, which means Indeed's engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners to this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms apply. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are trying to get a solid understanding of what the Oilers lineup is going to look like on opening night. Now, we are in the very early stages of not even the preseason. These informal skates, they are a nice gesture. It is a good way to get the team together, to get guys in the same room, especially for guys who haven't played together before, like Arvidsson, Skinner, and Draisaitl, to get somebody like Matthew Savoie reps with NHL talent to get an understanding of what he's going to need to do if he wants to force his way onto the team. But I tentatively am looking at it like this. I don't think Evander Kane is going to play at least until the trade deadline. The assumption is Evander Kane is going to come in for preseason testing. He's going to fail a physical. The Oilers are not going to put him on long-term injured reserve so they can accrue cap space. Right now, they have $945,000 in cap space. That cap space will begin to accrue once the regular season starts, and by the deadline, they're going to have $3.5 to $4 million or so to play with to add a roster player, whether that's one defenseman, whether that's a forward-ended defenseman, whether that's a goalie, because who knows how the season's going to unfold. But as you sit here, assume Evander Kane is not an option for a while. He very well might not be an option at all this season, maybe not even in the playoffs should the Oilers go far. But with no Evander Kane, the top six is relatively straightforward. You're not breaking up Hyman and McDavid, period. Tentatively, you are going to put Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on that line. I don't need Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on that line, but if you want to play him there, great. You also have the choice of doing Skinner. You also have the choice of doing Arvidsson. That's also great. You have three options to play there. Then you get to Draisaitl's line, which right now looks like he's going to be in the middle of Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson. You get to the third line, you have a bit of a drop-off. You have Janmark, who spent most of last season as a fourth liner. You have Adam Henrique, who took less money to be here to chase a Stanley Cup, which, great. And then you have Connor Brown. That Connor Brown spot is also a spot to keep an eye on that Matthew Savoie could push for in the preseason. If he has a good training camp and he puts himself in a position where he should make the team, the Oilers would then be in a position where they need to waive one of their veterans, whether it's Josh Brown, whether it's Corey Perry, and on paper, send them to the AHL to clear up the cap space to have Savoie on the opening night roster. I would like to, at various points this year, I would like to see Henrique play with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I would like to see Henrique play with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Victor Arvidsson, frankly. You heard me talk about this on yesterday's show, the idea of that being your salt the game away third line of dump the puck in, cycle, high to low, pressure on the defense. And yeah, you're trying to score, but at the same time, you also just want to maintain that offensive zone. So that way you're not on defense. That way there's no pressure on Skinner. That way there's no pressure on Nurse or Kulak or Emberson or Stetcher. That all you're doing is playing keep away in the offensive zone effectively. You're going to put some shots on net, but as a salt the game away trio, that has a lot of potential. And then your fourth line, you have Derek Ryan in the middle, you have Corey Perry on one side, and you have the choice between a few guys. It'll probably be Vasily Podkolzin to start the year, but that fourth line definitely leaves a little bit to be desired, but you have options. That is one of the benefits of having a third and fourth line that are relatively similar in talent level. And Janmark is more of a fourth liner than a third liner. And Connor Brown, you really don't know what you're going to get. I would like to think you're going to get the Connor Brown that popped in the Western Conference Final and the Stanley Cup Final. That was a menace on the penalty kill. The further removed he is from knee surgery, the more fluid, the more dynamic he looks. You would hope. There is no guarantee of that, but that is the hope. The Oilers also have the choices of guys who are still out there. I know Max Pacioretty signed a PTO with the Maple Leafs today. I would not be opposed if the Oilers wanted to give a really long look to James Van Riemsdyk. I know Van Riemsdyk is older. He's not nearly the player he used to be. But he's undoubtedly better than Janmark. He's almost certainly better than Corey Perry. He's probably better than Connor Brown. And he's definitely better than Vasily Podkolzin. Now, are you going to bring in James Van Riemsdyk to play on your fourth line? No, you're not. If you are going to sign James Van Riemsdyk even to a PTO, that means he's going to play on your third line, and that bumps Janmark down and bumps somebody else out of your lineup. I'm not saying they're going to sign James Van Riemsdyk, but I think he makes sense. I think he has a skill set. I think he has size. I think the Oilers, while Zach Hyman is a strong net front presence, it's not in the same way that Van Riemsdyk is, where Van Riemsdyk is physically imposing. He's big, he's strong. He can really clog that net front area and give you a little bit more diversity in your offensive attack, as we just talked about in regards to a Nugent-Hopkins, Henrique, and Arvidsson third line. If you drop James Van Riemsdyk on there instead of Arvidsson, still, you're going to have the opportunity to really grind the game away, and that's something the Oilers need the opportunity for. If they bring in Travis Dermott on a PTO for defense, I think that sends a message to Stetcher and Emberson that, hey, you're not just getting this job. You need to earn this. You need to show us that you are better than this guy, because if we can get this guy for league minimum, we're going to do that, and we're going to send you to the AHL, and you need to be ready, because the way your roster is constructed, you're not going to be able to have a robust bench. You're not going to be able to have 2 defensemen and a forward, or 2 forward and a defenseman, or 3 goalies. You are going to have 1 forward, 1 defenseman, and there might be nights where the Oilers can only dress one of those guys because of the way the cap rolls out. You know, the Oilers are rolling a lot of the dice on their ability to stay healthy and avoiding needing to dip into long-term injured reserve money, because once you put a player on LTIR, which is 24 days or 10 games, you don't accrue cap space anymore. And so much of the Oilers' plan for this season has to be banking on having money to play with at the trade deadline to make the roster deeper, because as good as it is forwards-wise, we all know it's a defenseman short right now. I think Emberson has more potential to stick than Stetcher, just because he's unproven and he has room, whereas Stetcher, I feel like, is relatively defined into what he is. We'll see if Dermott actually gets a PTO, as rumored. We'll see if he makes the team. We'll see if they give him an actual contract. But that is our first stab at the Oilers lineup for opening night on September 11th of 2024. I am sure after a few preseason games, we will take a different stab at this. We might tinker it a little bit more. We might have a Savoie. We might have a Dermott. We might have another forward or defenseman we're not thinking about that could force their way into the mix. So if you could be so kind before we get out of here, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell button so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. Is there anybody I am not thinking about that has a way of playing their way onto the team in the preseason? But before we get out of here, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends and provides national expertise with a local flavor. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.